many of the tropical and subtropical plants that we use in the landscape cannot survive our winter temperatures, but many of these produce a bulb or a tuber or some other storage organ that we can dig out of the ground and store over the winter, and then replace it next spring and carry that plant over through the winter months. Today we're going to look at storing some of these bulbs and tubers. Now, most bulbs prefer a dark location over the winter, and that keeps them in a dormant state. And I look at it as two different groups of bulbs. Those that like a dark and damp storage condition, and those that like a dark and dry condition. And so today we're going to look at the ones that like it a little damp over the winter months as they're in their dormancy. And these include plants like cannas, dahlias. This is a tuber of a sweet potato. And then our elephant ears, colocasias. These all like a little bit of a damp environment and dark while they're being stored. So the first thing I want to do is prepare a substrate to store them in that's going to have that damp feeling. And what I like to use is peat moss. This is some peat moss, and it's just slightly damp, but it's not wet. We don't want it to be wet because that can encourage fungus and other problems in our bulbs that'll cause them to rot. But I find it very difficult to bring peat moss to this condition where it's damp but not wet. So what I like to do is start with very wet peat. I'll soak it in water so that it's evenly wet, and then I'll spread it out onto black plastic or some other material, and spread it in a thin layer, and I'll let it dry. And if it's really warm and sunny, it might dry faster than if it's a bit overcast. So it could take a day or two to dry, and you want to check it regularly. And once it gets to that point where it's like this, where it's damp but not wet, you can put it in a bucket, bring it inside, and we'll use it for storing our bulbs. So to prepare your bulbs for storage, you want to dig them out of the ground, and I've dug mine a little bit early. It's a good idea to wait until the first frost. This part, the storage organs, are below the soil. And so if you do get that first frost, it's not going to damage this part of the plant, but it'll make the foliage die back a little bit. And then I cut off any extra foliage, and I leave them out to cure. And these I cured outside because it's still a little bit warm, but you could put them in a warm location indoors and store them indoors. You also, as they dry, you want to shake off the extra soil that's clinging to the roots of the plants. You can wash it off if it's really caked on, because you're going to leave these out to dry and cure as well. And then we're ready to store these. So we want to put them in a location where they're going to remain damp throughout the winter months. A little bit damp, a little bit moist. And so what I like to use is a plastic bag, or if you have an old ice chest, that makes an ideal storage container because it keeps the moisture in. But remember, we want it dark. So you want to use a black plastic bag, not a clear bag or a white bag that's going to let the light through. And then we're going to fill that with our peat moss. I'm just going to dump that in there. And we're going to layer our bulbs in among that peat. So I'm going to just use my cannas here. Remember that many of our bulbs look alike when they're in this dormant phase. So you want to be sure that you label them and know which canna or which elephant ear you might be storing. And then I cover these with the peat moss. And this is something we're going to then put into a dark location. Some ideal places might include a root cellar or a basement. If you have a storm shelter, a lot of time those have this cool environment. We're looking for temperatures between 35 and 50 degrees, which are going to keep our bulbs dormant, but also avoid freezing. You can also put them in the garage, but you want to put them up against the house, the wall that touches the house, because it's less likely to have freezing temperatures. Freezing will cause these bulbs to be destroyed. They're going to die with that freezing temperature, and usually they'll kind of turn to mush and rot. The other thing we want to do is watch these over the winter. We don't want to just put them in a dark location and forget about them. We're going to have it closed up, but we need to open it periodically and check that peat. Is it still damp or is it too wet? If it gets to be too dry, you can lightly mist and that'll add some moisture back in here. But if it feels like it's too wet, maybe some of the moisture's come out of the bulbs, just open the bag for a few hours and let some of that moisture dissipate. And then you can close it back up and return it to storage. Next spring, we'll be able to come back and plant these bulbs out into the garden. Some of them I like to start a little bit early in containers like our cannas and get them to come up before I put them in the garden. So we'll be sure to revisit that next spring.